All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. My name is Heather Egan-Sussman. I am co-chair of McDermott Will & Emery's Global Privacy and Data Protection Group. I'm moderating this terrific panel of subject matter experts who are going to talk today about recent amendments to the California Online Privacy Protection Act, known for short as CalOPPA. And of course, this is not just a discussion about the substance of the amendments, but also best practice recommendations for compliance. And so to kick off that discussion, here with me today are Joan McNabb, who is the Director of Privacy Education and Policy for the Office of the Attorney General in California's Department of Justice. Jeannie Barton, who is the Vice President and Director for the Accountability Program of the Advertising Self-Regulatory Council of the CBB, which is the Council of Better Business Bureaus. And finally, Todd Rubeck, who is the Chief Privacy Officer of Evidon. I'd like to just take a minute to thank Evidon and its team who's worked behind the scenes to make this day a success and for hosting this webinar and providing all the technical support to make it happen. We couldn't have done it without you, so thank you for that. You know, from my perspective, this webinar is about helping companies figure out how to navigate this new area of the law, potentially across the full range of digital services they're ultimately responsible for managing. You know, there's clearly interplay between CalOPPA and the DAA's self-regulatory framework for online behavioral advertising, so I think it's terrific that we have Joan and Jeannie and Todd, who each bring a different perspective to the tracking discussion. So Joan, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Jeannie, do we have you on the line?
Absolutely.
All right, and Todd?
I'm here.
Excellent. We have the trifecta. Our technical capabilities are working well, which is great. Thank you. So just an administrative matter, we have about an hour for our talk today, and during the discussion, the participants on the webinar have an opportunity to ask questions. You'll see on your GoToWebinar viewer control panel, there should be an area where you can type in your messages. So put them in, we'll add the messages, add the questions to the queue, and ask them as we go along. But I think the storyline here today is transparency. Transparency about information collection practices. And so against that backdrop, I think it's best probably to start with you, Joan, and talk about the background on CalOPPA.
Okay, thank you, Heather, and good morning. It's morning here anyway, and good afternoon to whoever is out there. I expect that most of the people on this call would be pretty familiar with CalOPPA, but just to remind you, this is the only law, I believe, that applies broadly to websites and online services that requires them to post a privacy policy if they collect personally identifiable information about California residents. And the law is pretty simple. It can be summarized as say what you do and do what you say. It says it makes certain requirements for what you have to disclose, pretty minimal requirements about what you have to disclose about your privacy practices, and then says once you've done that, you have to, of course, do what you say. Like most, in fact, of the consumer privacy statutes in California, it does not contain its own enforcement provisions, but it is enforceable through the unfair competition law. Violation is defined as either failing to post a policy within 30 days of having been notified that you don't have it, or knowingly and willfully or negligently and materially failing to comply with any of its provisions. And through the UCL, it includes injunctive relief and a number of penalties, but most of greatest interest, I expect, is up to $2,500 per violation. Because of the way our UCL works, it's really up to the Attorney General and the District Attorney to use it. It's for a consumer to use it, you must show monetary or property damage. Okay, next slide. Am I controlling my slides? No. Okay, but they're going. So this was the author's statement about what he was after in the bill that added these new requirements to CalOPPA. The Attorney General's office sponsored this bill. The author was Senator Matsucci from Southern California, and it was the only consumer privacy bill the Attorney General's office CalOPPA sponsored in 2013. There was one other that we were very supportive of and very much involved in, and that was regarding password breaches, adding passwords and online credentials to the breach notification law. So the purpose here is transparency. This is not a do not track bill. It is a tracking transparency bill to let consumers know, particularly when they have a do not track signal, what the site is doing in response to that, and so that consumers can make informed decisions. Next slide. It adds two new disclosures that an operator of a commercial website or online service must make in the operator's privacy policy. The first one is a disclosure regarding the operator's response to a do not track browser signal. The second is the operator's statement as to whether third parties may be present tracking on the operator site or service. More on that next. So let's look at the first disclosure requirement. It's laid out this way to reflect the fact that the two sides of the OR are parallel. So the requirement is for the operator to disclose how the operator responds to a web browser do not track signal or to another mechanism that provides consumers with the ability to exercise some choice regarding the collection of their personally identifiable information about the consumer's online activities over time and across third-party websites or services. So that is the implicit definition of online tracking in this statute for the purposes of this statute. It's collecting PII across sites and over time. And this requirement to make this disclosure is if the operator engages in that collection. I will also say that this concept of other mechanisms, that was to allow for other mechanisms that may exist or that may come to exist in the future beyond do not track signals or in other modes other than the browser. At this point, I don't know if there are any such things, but if there were, and that were what operated on your service, that would be what you would be describing your response to. Next. The law provides an alternative to making that direct statement about how the operator responds. As an alternative, the operator may instead provide a clear and conspicuous link in the privacy policy to someplace else online which contains a description, including the effects, of a program or protocol that the operator follows that offers the consumer that choice. That choice being, as we say in 5, the choice regarding the collection of personally identifiable information across sites and over time. So a program that provides consumers that choice. So that's an alternative to the direct statement of the operator's response. And next, the second disclosure that's required is the operator is to disclose whether others may be collecting personally identifiable information about activities across sites and over time when the consumer is on the operator's site. So whether, that's what it says. That one's probably pretty clear. Next. So now, that's the law. That was the literal language of the law, the new provisions. Now I'm going to be talking about a project that we are engaged in and not quite complete, that is not quite complete, to provide some recommended practices regarding being transparent about online tracking. So the intention of the practices, the intention of the recommendations is to push toward making the entire privacy policy more effective as a communication piece. And the recommendations related to tracking are going to be included in a larger discussion, larger set of recommendations on how to develop a meaningful privacy policy, and the other recommendations related to other disclosures and format, et cetera, are taken from documents we already have published, but pulling them all together in one place so we have one document that's about privacy policies. So some of them are coming from our recommended practices guide on mobile called Privacy on the Go. Some are coming from another guide that also speaks to Shine the Light law as well as privacy policies. So they'll all be pulled together, and the new material in it will be the introductory part and the recommendations related to tracking transparency. Next page. Further, this recommended practices guide is not a compliance guide. It's not legal opinions about the law. It is truly an attempt to push toward best practices for accomplishing the intent of the law. That being, in the case of privacy policies, some of our recommendations, which you're going to see in draft, some of our recommendations are beyond what the law requires. The document at the beginning will give an overview of the law, and then it will go on with the recommended practices. Okay, next. So here's a couple of recommendations. The first one being that to title the section of the policy that addresses do not track or online tracking so that a consumer can find it. And then the second recommendation is that describing this is all directed to the operator, describing your response in your privacy policy is preferable to providing a link to a program or protocol that offers a choice about that. Because the direct statement of the response we see as greater transparency. So that is clearly beyond what the law requires. The law gives you an option. We're saying we recommend taking this option. Next. And
Joan, this is Heather. I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to interrupt you earlier when you were giving your overview because we have a few questions coming in. But I actually think that those questions are probably addressed best with this slide. So what I'll have you do is run through this slide, and then I'll go back and ask you a few of the questions.
Perfect. So in our recommendations, which are in draft, let me go back and let you know about the status. I meant to say that earlier. So we had a first meeting of about 20 some odd people, pretty broad spectrum of perspectives, and 76 people on the phone on December 10th. Then we circulated a first draft on December 20th and got it to about 80 people. Anybody who ever has wanted to have it could have it. We circulated a second draft on January 22nd that had made to which we had made some changes in response to the comments on the first draft. Those comments on the second draft have been received. We're just going over them all and looking to what we're going to do finally, and our aim is to publish this as soon as we can in February. So what you're seeing here are recommendations that are the second draft that do not reflect comments made on the second draft. So
all right, fair enough.
So it's a draft. In the recommendations, and this is actually a suggestion of somebody in the first meeting, that a helpful way to provide recommendations can be to provide sort of questions to consider. So these are, and this is one of the changes we made from the first draft, they're to clarify questions to consider, not necessarily questions you have to answer in what you write, but questions to consider, questions to which you ought to have the answers in your head, even if you aren't deciding you're going to put all of it into the disclosure. So regarding the first disclosure about the operator's response, do you treat DNT signal browsing consumers differently from those who don't have a DNT signal? Specifically, do you continue to collect PII on browsing activities as they leave your site if they have a DNT signal? If you do that, how do you use it? Now, the law doesn't require you to say how you use it. We're saying that's something you might think about, and you certainly should be clear on. So
right. Again, along the theme of best practices,
yes.
We're discussing today best practices, not necessarily what minimum compliance would mean.
Exactly.
But Joan, if it's okay with you, can we just step back for one moment, which seems to almost be a precursor question to this, and I have a few questions coming in from the attendees that are similar along these themes, which are, what if you operate a service that doesn't collect PII data, maybe only anonymous cookie data, for example? Does that company have to announce how they respond to DNT?
Look back at the first disclosure in the statute. It's a few slides back. It's slide number 7, and you'll see that it says disclose if the operator engages in that collection.
And what if the operator just permits third parties to engage in that collection through its site? Does that count?
If you go a couple of slides forward to now one more, yeah. So there's no such qualifier on this one.
Okay, so you'd have to meet subsection 6 of AB 370. You'd need to disclose that kind of third-party activity is going on, but that may not necessarily trip up Clause 5 or Clause 7.
Right.
Okay. So then the
want
obligation to disclose how you respond to do not track signals really flows from whether you, as that operator, are engaging in the collection, not whether you permit third parties to engage in the collection. Is that correct?
What would be your judgment?
Yes,
I think so.
That's my conclusion. So. That is absolutely my conclusion.
I think
that's how I read the statute. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Mm-hmm. I'm not. I don't want to put you on the spot. I think that's a lot of folks who are calling in are interested to hear what your office thinks. But I understand that particularly when you're drafting a best practices document, it can sometimes be difficult to formulate those conclusions so concretely, particularly in this kind of audience. And we will. Jeannie and Todd and I will jump in as we can with our collective responses.
And a non-cross-site tracking operator may want to say that.
That's a great point.
The law doesn't say that. The law says you have to make that disclosure if you da-da-da-da.
Fair enough. Okay, then how about, let's just delve a little bit more, if it's okay with you, into the definition of PII. So anonymous browser behavior reflected in a browser's cookies, is that considered PII?
We don't have a slide that gives the definition, but I will tell you that the definition lists first, there are 7 subsets as, it says PII, individual identifiable about an individual consumer collected online by the operator from the individual and maintained by the operator in an accessible form, including any of the following. The first 5 are like name and social security number, things like that everybody recognizes. Then number 6 is any other identifier that permits the physical or online contacting of a specific individual. And 7 is information concerning a user that the website or online service collects online from the user and maintains in personally identifiable form in combination with an identifier described in this subdivision. So between 6 and 7, a device ID that permits sending an online targeted ad, would seem.
This is Jeannie. So that is, I would say, does sweep in interest-based advertising as Joan is explaining it. We do not consider that PII, but we do not just cover PII. We cover exactly that practice under the Digital Advertising Alliance principles. So I think that there is a great deal of, shall I say, sort of movement in what PII is defined as. The original definitions in CalOPPA are our traditional understanding of PII, but it looks as though, from what Joan is saying, that CalOPPA, like the FTC revisions to the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, is considering that the ability to contact a user's device through an ad is tantamount to contacting the user, him or herself.
And
I think this is, go ahead, Joan, sorry.
The definition isn't new. The definition isn't new.
Right.
No.
The definition isn't new, but I think this is something that folks are really struggling with. We actually got a few questions in from webinar attendees asking, do the new disclosures apply to operators who collect PII generally, or only to those who collect PII that's being used for OBA purposes? So there is an intermingling of these two concepts. And I think what you're saying, Joan, very clearly is that in fact it's the former. It applies to any entity that collects PII generally. You have to make your disclosures about the sorry, go ahead.
The disclosure, though, like the first disclosure is whether you, the operator, are collecting PII. Now, this isn't literally what it says, from your visitors, customers, after they leave. You know, that is across site over time, across third-party sites over time. So that's when you have to make the first disclosure, not what you're doing while they're on your site.
Got it. Great point to make that distinction. So hopefully that responds to a few of the questions that we have outstanding here.
Yeah, and under our lingo, that would mean that when you, the website operator, are not really a first party anymore, but you are acting as a third party collector on other websites.
Got it. That's a great distinction to make, Jeannie. So we've got a few other questions here, and I think just knowing what's coming in some of the slides, what I'd like to do is hold some of them so that we can continue to get through these slides, because I think that the discussion will continue and we'll be able to see sort of the two sides of the different coins and potentially talk about some solutions, Todd, when we get to your section talking about what are some potential ways that companies can implement compliance mechanisms here. So let's keep moving through, if it's okay with you, Joan, on these draft recommendations.
Okay. And next slide. So I'm considering that what we're doing right now is these are sort of out for comment, you know, so you can comment through this process. So this is about the alternate way to making your direct description. So this one. This is just a piece. Is that 15? How about 14? Did we do 14? I'm sorry. Maybe I moved you too fast. Yes. So if you decide not to describe your response directly, then provide the clear and conspicuous link, which is what the law says. And what we are recommending is that in addition to the link, that you, in your own policy, when you are providing the link, that you identify or describe the program. So it isn't just, here's what we say about tracking, press here. That you actually say, this is a program that gives you choices or whatever. I'm not saying what it should say, but that you make clear what the link, you give a little bit of information about what the link is going to link to. And then the next page, the next slide. And here are some questions, again, to consider. Although one feel like, you know, if you're sending somebody to a program but you aren't going to abide by that program, that's probably should be a concern. So, you know, you should, and we recommend, the statute doesn't say this, that you should say that in your policy. Another question you should have answered in your mind, whether or not you say this, is another question, is does the thing that you're linking to clearly explain the effects on the consumer of participating in that program? Because including the effects is a line right from the statute. So that is whether participating stops the collection of PII across sites over time, the effects on the consumer. And then also you should consider does this page make clear how the consumer can participate? Is there a clear button or whatever on the page? So how whatever it is that you're linking to presents consumers with what they should do if they want to take advantage of that choice. Okay. And now the other disclosure, which is whether third parties may be collecting PII on your visitors on your site or service, and the questions that you might consider. And this is an area where we've gotten a lot of comments, and we also recognize that it makes good sense. We're going to sort of change the way these questions are presented to make them even more what controls you might possibly be able to use, but something to think about. So it's sort of moving toward thinking about exerting some control. The law does not say that. So what controls would you use, might you use, to control what third parties might be on your site conducting tracking of your visitors and users, and how you would verify that, and would you be able to, I'm sort of changing it to how it might be being changed, would you be able to ensure that they follow your policy? The statute doesn't say that. All of these recommended practices. These are questions to consider, not even things you have to say, and this is a recommendation, not a law. They're the kinds of things we think you ought to have the answer to in your mind. And then in general, of course, I think this is the last recommendation. It could be the first. And this is true about anything you say in your privacy policy, but I think with tracking, because it can be difficult to do, you should be checking with your techies on what actually are we doing technically, what is actually happening regarding tracking, obviously.
Joan, before we move on to this slide, can I go back 2 slides which talk about the providing a link to the program offering choice, slide number 15?
Yeah.
One of the questions from a participant is that what do you have in mind when you're referring to the program offering choice?
The language actually says the program regarding choice, the language in the statute. Here I'm saying offering. If you go back and look at the statute, it says regarding, which might be slightly different from, slightly less than offering. But so potential, I actually don't want to prescribe any program here.
Okay, fair enough. And we have others folks, I think, who will probably weigh in on that discussion and give their thoughts, and I can certainly add as well. But the question was asked, so I wanted to make sure that we got that to you.
I'm not trying to be evasive.
No, of course. And then the other question that I got is, well, and maybe Jeannie, what we do is we talk to you about this one, and this is a tandem for you, Joan, and you, Jeannie. But the question is actually directed to the Attorney General's office, which is, how does the California Attorney General's office feel about Google's response to this amendment, i.e., that Google is a first party, and Google is a first party not responding to do not track signals? I'm not sure. I don't really understand the question. Does that?
And I'm not going to be rendering any opinion on any particular company's practice at this point.
All right, fair enough.
Well, I will offer a possible interpretation of what Google is saying, but I can't offer it with regard to CalOPPA, but only with regard to what some people in the industry think is a distinction between first and third party, and a distinction which I think is becoming increasingly blurry, but which under the DAA principles and some prior FTC staff statements, if this is enough hedging, I expect it is more than enough hedging, but it goes back to the distinction of what is a first party. Is a first party only the immediate website that you are interacting with, or is it the website and all its affiliates, whether you as a consumer can recognize that they are affiliates, or is it a website and those brands that a reasonable consumer would consider to be recognized as part of that first party. And different people have different answers to that question. One thing that I would say is that being transparent, as Joan has said, is always a best practice. Making sure that consumers understand what you mean is always a best practice. Google itself, when it offered its privacy dashboard to let people know what kinds of information was being collected in terms of profiling, found that that tended to build consumer trust. So I commend Joan Bott for not only having the idea of transparency and best practices as her modus operandi, but also for being so transparent and offering us all the opportunity to comment on these best practices. I just wanted to give a little shout out before it got too late.
Agreed. Well done. It's been a very collaborative process up to this point, allowing receiving that feedback and truly taking it to heart. So thank you, Joan. So I have questions are coming in fast and furiously. I think just for purposes of continuing to move this on, because a number of these do touch on first party versus third party. And Jeannie, I think you've got some thoughts on that. Why don't we continue to move through the slides, and then as we get to the slides, we'll come up with those. Does that sound fair?
Great. So I'll take the ball and run for a bit, Heather. And hello, everybody out there in the internet world. And Joan, again, I just want to echo Jeannie Barton's shout out to you. It's pretty rare to see a regulator that has worked so hard to collaborate with private industry to really create something, create best practices. So I commend you. The process has been open, and you've given us an opportunity to have a very engaging conversation. So, I'm going to take it up a level or two, because, what Everdon does is, we were born out of the concept that transparency is good business, and it's just like the right thing to do. And now we're, seeing that concept is being codified into law, with CalOPPA being the first one. But just this past week, I was in the UK speaking at a privacy event, and I got to tell you, what's on everyone's mind is transparency. So whether it's in the EU, whether it's at the state level, or whether it's here in the federal level, transparency is the buzzword of the day, and I'm going to be writing a blog post about it next week. I fear that the word may be overused very soon, and then going the way that Synergy went around 2001, 2000. But notwithstanding that, Everdon recently did a study in partnership with the company Soluna that showed transparency is good for business. At the end of the day, it helps companies sell more stuff. To be very simplistic about it, we found from that study that, and this was a study that was just released, I think 2 days ago, January 29th, that 86% of the respondents had a higher opinion of transparent brands. And supporting that, 75% of consumers said they're more likely to buy from brands that are transparent, meaning open and honest about their online data collection practices. So it's just a good idea. So what Everdon does is, amongst other things, is we have tools that help companies be transparent, because it's one thing to aspire to it, it's another thing to operationalize it. We help companies operationalize transparency. And we have two tools that help you do that, and they're a really good fit for implementing best practices for CalOPPA. The first tool is called Evidon Labs. This is also Evidon Analytics. And what that allows you to do is know all the tracking on your website and as well as your apps in the mobile environment so you can properly disclose them for CalOPPA. And the second tool is Evidon Inform, in this case Site Notice. And it allows people it allows organizations to disclose and give control to the consumer over a company's online practices. So our first tool, the step one in being able to implement best practices under CalOPPA, as I mentioned, is called Evidon Analytics. And it, at its most basic form, reveals all the invisible tracking and activity going on any given website. We can show all the analytics companies and retargeters and ad exchanges and networks and DMPs and advertisers, whatever the case may be, that's on a website to give a company the raw data points, the actual objective information, so they can make an intelligent decision on how to govern the activity on their website and how to make the right disclosures. Hold on for a second. I'm sorry. Okay, so yeah, Evidon Analytics, it provides a comprehensive view of all the trackers, who are they, how they got there, and whether they're authorized or unauthorized. And if they're unauthorized, how you get rid of them. And again, as I said, with this effective data, you can make the decisions that are best practices for your organization, so you can best inform your consumer. And this works across all platforms, websites, mobile apps, and sites, as well as social pages. And this is just a visualization of all the invisible activity happening on any given website. And we don't pass judgment whether it's nefarious or not. I mean, this is just, this is what's happening on a website. And in order to make proper disclosures and achieve best practices, you just need this information before you can do so. So this, what you're looking at now is really supports, Joan, what you were saying before regarding having a discrete and separate section in a privacy policy which discloses or discusses your approach towards do not track. And here is just proposed language that we have found is effective. And all this is language that has been circulated around and submitted to the Attorney General. This is not templated language that a company can use, but it's an example of what some organizations are using to disclose their approach towards do not track and how they respond to the browser-based DNP signal. But Evidon plays most strongly in the second disclosure regarding whether online tracking, or excuse me, whether other parties are tracking or collecting personal information on your site or your apps. And here's also proposed language that we have found is very effective regarding the third-party tracking that can be used in the new section or paragraph in a privacy policy. And at the bottom of this section, there's a hyperlink where you can click through to our tool, which I mentioned earlier, Evidon Inform. And in this case, it's a product called Site Notice. And this gives the consumer more detailed information about the tracking that's happening on the website by third parties. And in the top of the screen next to the Evidon brand, you can drop in whatever disclosure language you want, including language that talks about the effect of the tracking and the effect to the consumer if they choose to control and opt out of that tracking. And then in the bottom part of the tool, we actually list out all the tracking by type and by company that's found on a website, and we give the consumer or the website visitor the ability to opt out or control that activity. So those are some technical solutions to implement or operationalize the best practices. Are certainly available offline to talk about it, but in the meantime, Heather, I'm going to kick it back to you.
All right, thanks. I had committed at the outset that I was just going to read straight through the questions as they came in, but we got so many questions. I think what we'll have to do, just in the interest of time, is if we can't get to the questions, just responding back just separately. But let me give you one of the questions that came in for you, Todd, and that is, how is the Evidon analytics tool different from Ghostery?
So that's a great question. So Ghostery is a product that Evidon owns, and it powers it is the foundation of our analytics tool. So Ghostery is a free browser extension which over 20 million people have downloaded. And what it does, it allows an individual to see who's or what companies are tracking her on any given website and control that tracking. And of those 20+ million people who've downloaded it, we have about between 10 and 12 million people who have expressly opted into being on a panel, which allows us to see who's tracking them as they traverse the internet. AI on individuals, what we do is we gather the information on the trackers as someone goes from site to site. And from that, we built a very exhaustive and extensive library. And this allows us to really have both a broad and deep view of all the invisible activity happening on the internet. We can see across 26 million websites and 150 million URLs. And we take that information, we combine that ghost rank pool of data with a proprietary scanner we built, and that is our analytics product that organizations can license, and they can scan on their own website any URLs, any of their sites or their apps, and they can see all of the invisible activity. So it shines a light on their sites, so they can see not only all of the invisible activity on a site, which Ghostery gives you, but also the interrelationship between all of that activity, and that's something that Ghostery doesn't go as far as. So you can see not only the authorized tracking, but also all the downstream trackers that your authorized third parties have brought onto your site.
That's very helpful. And certainly for companies that are really grappling with this disclosure requirement and who want to make sure that the disclosures that they're making in their website privacy policies are accurate, that this is one tool to help give them that visibility. So
that's exactly right.
And Heather, just to be clear, the disclosure that's required in the new provision is whether third parties may be conducting tracking, not who they are, but more transparency is more better.
Right. We're responding to your best practices suggestion, Joan,
yeah.
I think, which is don't just say that it's happening, right? Don't just say, yeah, we may do this, but maybe talk a little more in depth about, at least this is what I'm gleaning from your best practices document, what you'd like to see happen is more discussion about what type of tracking, what type of data, what may be uses of that data that are happening even beyond the interest-based advertising ecosystem. So why don't I, with that, let's turn it over to Jeannie Barton, who's going to talk about the accountability program. And Jeannie, we're getting a lot of questions coming in about first-party versus third-party collection and whether California disclosure applies to one but not the other. And so maybe we can weave in, just as you're talking through your comments, just some responses to that range of questions.
I will do my best. And it will help us to illustrate that while there is extensive overlap between what Joan's best practices and some of the requirements of the statutes and the DAA program, in some respects the DAA program requires more than the statute, and in some respects what the DAA program does is not the same, and therefore it will be important if you are using Section 7, that is, complying with a program like the DAA program, that you are clear about that's what you're doing and here's what it does. We are working very hard to make sure that everyone understands what the DAA program does and that the links to the DAA program will make that clear to consumers. So with that, let me quickly run through what the DAA program does. If I could have the next slide. 27, right. Okay, there are three sets of principles: the online behavioral or interest-based advertising principles, the multi-site data principles, and the guidance for mobile. The multi-site principles are not at issue here, but I just want to remind people that they forbid using this kind of data collected across websites and over time to make eligibility decisions, such as eligibility for employment or promotion. But we're going to focus on the two main principles, which are coextensive, or at least overlap with CalOPPA's do not track transparency requirement. And that is the DAA's transparency, or what I call notice and enhanced notice, and consumer control, which is choice or ability to opt out of certain forms of tracking. Next slide. Okay. Transparency under the Digital Advertising Alliance principles requires a website disclosure. And that means, what are you doing with respect to tracking either by other third parties on your website for use in OBA, your own tracking as a third party, if that's something that you would get into in your own privacy policy, or you might just get into it by providing that notice in your ads if you were actually serving those ads. And then you also have to have a link to a real choice or opt-out mechanism. You must also state your adherence to the principles, and if you recall, that was one of the things that Joanne talked about, as well as encouraging this kind of website disclosure. We also require that this website disclosure be in an easy-to-find separate section of the privacy policy or elsewhere on the website. Needn't be in the privacy policy. And here's the important thing, which I believe really goes beyond what is being recommended, but we think is an important and innovative kind of transparency for consumers. And this is what we call enhanced notice. And that is real-time notice when a third party is collecting information on your website. And that notice has to be on every page of that website where data is being collected. And it needs to link to your explanation of what you are doing in terms of OBA collection and use by third parties, and link to an opt-out mechanism. The kind of notice that Todd showed you that Evidon provides is sufficient to meet that requirement. It is not only enhanced notice is not only required on the website, but it is also required whenever an interest-based or OBA ad is served to a consumer. There needs to be the little ad choices icon, which when clicked on, tells the consumer that this is an ad based on your interests, and if you don't want to receive those kinds of ads, there will either be a list of all the third parties involved in the serving of this ad, or a link to the Digital Advertising Alliance or other industry developed websites. Now that website link,
with your permission, I think we have, let's move to the next slide if it's okay, because I think it's a good segue for
good. I'm
the
happy.
interplay with CalOPPA, if that's okay. We're
It's
getting
fine.
the detail of the DAAs and what's required under the self-regulatory framework is obviously so important to the discussion. I think with the short time we have left, let's talk about the interplay with CalOPPA.
Okay. So what we're saying, and this slide doesn't really do it, but here are the differences. We're not talking about collection of information, all information. We're talking about collection by third parties of information to be used in OBA ads. We are also not talking about an opt-out that will opt you out of all collection, but an opt-out which will opt the consumer out of all use for interest-based advertising by the third parties that are listed on the DAA website. And that is about 95% of all tracking. But the website tries to make its limitations clear so that no consumer would feel that it was not a transparent disclosure as required under CalOPPA. Because as Joan pointed out, CalOPPA talks about what the consumer is offered regarding, not what choices the consumer is offered. Next slide. Okay, and this is just a brief tips beyond the scope necessarily of the DAA.
And we'll be, just so you know, Jeannie, too, we're going to make available to all the participants the slide deck after the presentation, so they'll all have these to take with them.
Good, and just so people know, I'm happy to answer any questions. Just beware, the one thing I want you to know is you're going to have to do an extensive inquiry with people in your company about what in the world free services they may have ordered that allow third parties to collect data on the website. This is a notorious thing that happens where your employees decide, gee, this looks like a great free service, and they don't look at the terms of service, and your website is the product and your data is the product. Okay, do I have any more slides?
You do. So the next one really just highlights, slide 31 highlights that other online location containing a description, which we've gone over. So I think it's the next slide,
Great.
32, that talks about the interplay.
Okay. So if you include a statement of adherence, the link to the DAA site, and your third-party disclosure, you may, and I cannot opine for the Attorney General, nor would I, but you may meet the terms of subsection 7, and I certainly think you would be making a very good faith effort to do so. And anyway, it's a twofer because I believe we are an industry-wide self-regulatory program, so I enforce compliance across the entire industry. We are not a membership organization. And we
I
are
like
working,
it, a twofer. That's a great way to put it.
So we're
Joan,
working
do you have
hard.
a response to that?
Sorry?
Again, I'm not going to be giving legal opinions here, but the only
Sure.
thing I would just emphasize, and as Jeannie has been emphasizing, is that the page that you link to should describe the effects on the consumer.
And if you don't feel that it does to your own satisfaction, add a few words as belts and suspenders with whatever you link to so that you can be sure that you have transparency for consumers. Obviously, lawyers don't like to promise more than is delivered or over-define what they're doing in ways that they can't meet. But I think that it won't take much to be absolutely clear, and that will be both helpful to your consumers and certainly a best practice under CalOPPA.
Great. So if we can go on to the next slide here, you had one other slide on consumer control principle.
And that just shows you it's actually too small for you to really see effectively, but just go to aboutads.info and you will see an explanation of the consumer control principle and that consumer choice page with a check mark. If you click on that, it takes you directly to the opt-out. And the opt-out lists every company from which you can opt out by clicking on the All link on that page. So that is a clear description of what the opt-out offers. And the principles themselves are a detailed explanation of what the program covers and by inference what it doesn't cover. I think the hard thing to balance in transparency is giving the consumer the information that will help the consumer make an informed choice without giving the consumer so much technical information that it stops being helpful. And that is a difficult balancing act. I don't think it has been successfully achieved yet in terms of defining do not track. And I think that there is a great deal of consumer confusion, both in over-promising that do not track means that nobody will be collecting any information about you, which is not true since there is no common definition of do not track. And some people would think that do not track covers first-party collection right on the website you are visiting, whereas it does not under any definition I know of. So this is just by way to say, define what you do or define what program you adhere to.
And Jeannie, on the third-party thing, I direct people back to the new statute where it says the obligations are on the first party to make the disclosures. The operator doesn't say first party, it says operator. The definition, the implicit definition of online tracking is collecting PII across third party. That's the language in the statute. Sites or services over time. So there.
Right, and increasingly the burden is being put on website operators to give very full disclosures because they are the party that interfaces directly with the consumer. But as the statute, I think, recognizes when it says what you may be able to do, and what Todd clearly pointed out, is that what a website operator knows about who is on the website is not perfect, and therefore you're making a best faith effort to be clear and to know what is going on at any moment in a dynamic system that has many interrelated parties.
So I think, one of the questions that we get regularly is, why would I want to adhere to best practice? Why should I strive for best practice when really, I have only limited time and resources to invest? What's the minimum I need to do to comply? And Joan, can I start with you with just a brief response to that?
Well, transparency is good. Being more transparent is good for consumers, and I think good for business. Now, if you're going to have to make some changes in order to comply with the law, you're already going to have to devote some sort of attention. Although this doesn't say do track or don't track, it just says say what you're doing. This is not a do not track law, I want to keep saying. You're going to have to make some changes anyway, so why not make them to a higher standard? That's what I would say.
And then one other.
Heather,
go ahead.
Heather, let me jump in again and just repeat what I started off with earlier. It's the right thing to do, again, this is the first of what I am anticipating to be many transparency laws. I'm anticipating that in a few years' time, we're going to have many states have different flavors of CalOPPA. Much like what we saw with the data breach notification laws with California SB 1386. So this is the time for companies to start thinking about it. And again, as there's a lot of research and as well as academics coming in saying it's good for business and helps you sell more stuff. So there's a strong value proposition for aspiring to a higher standard, going beyond just the letter of the law and actually being very open and honest with your customers, which is hard to argue against for anyone.
And I will just quickly add that there has been a study that shows that consumers are, I think it is 4 times more likely to click on an ad that has something like the icon on it that gives them a sense of trust. And I would also suggest not that we are going to see a million regulations springing up, and I wouldn't call them like flowers, but springing up, that real industry-wide compliance with a strong self-regulatory best practice standard can make sure that whatever laws are passed, they are laws that are in keeping with the kind of transparency and consumer control that is characteristic of CalOPPA and that can be met by adherence to a self-regulatory program, meaning that your burden is not greater and that your ability to interact positively with your consumers is.
I don't hear anything.
Sorry, I was on mute. I apologize.
Oh.
So it's Heather. I have a lot of questions coming in, flooding in and so I'm trying to organize some of them, but we're short on time. I think this is probably the most common question that's come up, which is let's talk about online tracking. Do you mean only tracking for online behavioral advertising purposes? What about things like analytics? Does it matter who's doing the analytics?
So the definition that's in the statute, that's the implicit definition, is collecting PII regarding about an individual consumer's online activities over time and across third-party websites or online services. It's not about use, it's about collection.
Okay, so if the analytics service provider is collecting data across other third parties as the user may leave and go to other sites?
If the operator is having that done, is I guess what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Okay.
So,
what about tracking for? Go ahead.
That could be disclosed.
Right. Understood. What about tracking for permitted purposes under the DAA's framework? So fraud prevention.
Yeah, that can be disclosed.
Okay.
Because this definition isn't about use. It's only about collection.
Got it.
You know,
Jeannie, did you have a thought?
Well, I have a sigh and an alas, and I hope that Joan will take it just as a comment, and that is that when you start trying to enumerate all the things that are going on for what the FTC has called internal operations purposes, and those include fraud, they include frequency capping, they include analytics to improve the interactions of a consumer with websites. Now, I take your point that this is across websites and over time, but there are a lot of analytics that benefit the consumer that are those things, like frequency capping so that you don't see the same ad 500 times, or any kind of tracking that goes on over time for fraud prevention. So I understand that the statute on its face would appear to cover those things, but I would hope that as one develops a rule of reason and looks at industry practices and consumer transparency benefits, that there could be a way to not require overburdensome disclosures that are, I think, more confusing than helpful. But that's my own personal opinion.
Yeah, I take that. Thanks, Eugenie. And also, I just wanted to point out that the statute says describe how you respond to a DNT browser signal. It doesn't say describe how you track. It says your response to a DNT browser signal.
I think that's very helpful, Joan.
Mm-hmm.
So just briefly, Joan, one other question. CalOPPA also applies to mobile and apps. Will the Attorney General be enforcing there as well as online?
Of course.
All right. And why don't we wrap up there since we're a little over time. We appreciate those who've hung in with us. We'll be making available the slides afterwards. I tried to get through a number of the questions, but there are still many that went unanswered, and so I appreciate your patience. What we'll do is likely reach out to you separately, and if you don't hear from us, I welcome you to send me or any of the panelists an email. My job today was to moderate rather than weigh in necessarily, so I'm happy to do that. We also have a follow-on panel my partner Julia Jacobson and I will be doing through Lorman Educational Services to do a follow-on webinar, which is, where do we go from here? What does my company do in light of all of this guidance and information? And so if you'd like more details on that, please let me know. Thank you to Joan, to Jeannie, to Todd, again to Evidon for hosting this webinar. It's been terrific. We appreciate your perspectives, and thank you to everyone who stayed on the line even past the time. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.